The American Revolution did not begin as a simple demand for independence. In the 1760s, many colonists still saw themselves as loyal subjects of the British Crown. What they wanted, at first, was not a new nation, but protection for rights they believed they already possessed. The 13 colonies had developed habits of local self-government, with colonial assemblies and communities used to managing many of their own affairs. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, Britain tried to tighten imperial control and raise money from the colonies. To officials in London, this looked reasonable. The empire had fought an expensive war, and the colonies benefited from victory. To colonists, it looked like a dangerous shift. Taxes and rules were now being imposed by a parliament where they had no direct representation. That disagreement over authority became the seed of revolution. The Stamp Act of 1765 turned frustration into organized resistance. The law required many printed materials, including newspapers, licenses, and legal documents, to carry a paid stamp. The tax touched lawyers, merchants, printers, and ordinary readers, which made it highly visible. But the deeper issue was constitutional. Colonial opponents argued that Parliament had no right to tax people who had no representatives in Parliament. This was the famous complaint of taxation without representation. Delegates from several colonies gathered at the Stamp Act Congress in New York and issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. They still argued as Englishmen defending inherited rights, not as Americans rejecting Britain entirely. Yet the meeting mattered because it taught separate colonies to act together. A dispute over stamped paper became a rehearsal for continental political coordination. When the Stamp Act was repealed, the conflict only paused. Parliament soon passed the Townshend Acts in 1767, placing duties on imported goods such as tea, paper, paint, lead, and glass. These taxes revived the same fear: if Parliament could tax the colonies without consent, then colonial liberty depended on the goodwill of distant politicians. Boycotts spread, merchants cooperated, and groups such as the Sons of Liberty helped organize public resistance. The dispute was no longer about one tax rate. It was about who held final power in the empire. Britain responded by sending troops to Massachusetts, especially Boston, to enforce order. For British authorities, soldiers were a tool of stability. For many colonists, they were proof that the empire was willing to use military pressure against its own subjects. Each attempt to control resistance made resistance feel more justified. Boston became the emotional center of the crisis. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a hostile crowd, killing several colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The event was complicated, but revolutionary propaganda made its message clear: armed imperial power could become deadly. 3 years later, the Boston Tea Party escalated resistance again. Members of the Sons of Liberty destroyed taxed tea belonging to the British East India Company by throwing it into Boston Harbor. This was not merely a protest against tea. It was a direct rejection of Parliament's right to impose revenue measures on the colonies. Britain answered with punitive laws designed to break Massachusetts politically and economically. Instead of isolating Boston, those laws convinced many colonists that the same loss of self-government could happen anywhere. Punishment produced solidarity, and solidarity turned local anger into a wider revolutionary movement. In 1774, 12 colonies sent delegates to the First Continental Congress. This gathering did not immediately declare independence, but it created a structure for common action. The delegates coordinated boycotts, protested British measures, and encouraged networks of local committees. Those committees were essential because revolutions do not run on speeches alone. They need communication, enforcement, supplies, and people capable of turning political emotion into practical organization. By 1775, Georgia had joined the broader movement, and the crisis was hardening on both sides. King George III declared Massachusetts to be in rebellion. Patriot leaders increasingly believed that ordinary appeals would not restore their rights. Britain saw defiance that had to be crushed, patriots saw coercion that had to be resisted. The space for compromise narrowed as both sides began acting like the conflict was already more than a political dispute. War began when British forces tried to seize colonial arms and supplies in Massachusetts. At Lexington and Concord in April 1775, militia and British troops exchanged fire. The military scale was limited, but the political meaning was enormous. Once blood was shed, the crisis could not easily return to petitions and negotiations. The Second Continental Congress met in May and began acting like a provisional government. It created the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. Washington's selection was strategic. He had military experience, but he also came from Virginia, which helped show that the war was not just a New England quarrel. The new army surrounded Boston, and in March 1776 British forces evacuated by sea. For the Patriots, that success proved that organized resistance could challenge imperial power. It also made independence feel more possible than it had only months earlier. Even in 1776, independence was not inevitable. Many colonists feared the consequences of a complete break with Britain. Some remained loyal to the crown, while others wanted reconciliation if their rights could be secured. But events kept pushing Congress toward a more radical position. In May 1776, Congress moved to suppress royal authority and encouraged colonies to create their own governments. That was a major shift. It meant legitimacy was being transferred from the king to locally created political authority. On July 2, Congress passed the Lee Resolution, supporting independence. On July 4, it adopted the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration changed the logic of the struggle. It no longer argued only for the rights of Englishmen. It spoke of natural rights, equality, and government based on the consent of the governed. A rebellion over imperial policy became a revolution about political legitimacy itself. The Declaration's ideals were powerful, but the new nation was born with contradictions. It claimed that all men are created equal, yet political rights were limited, slavery continued, women were excluded from formal political power, and indigenous nations were not treated as equal participants in the new order. That does not make the revolutionary language meaningless. It makes it unfinished. The revolution created a public standard that later generations could use to challenge the country's own failures. Its promise was broader than its immediate reality. This is why the American Revolution should not be understood as the instant creation of modern democracy. It was a breakthrough in republican government and rights-based political language, but it existed within the limits and prejudices of the 18th century. Its legacy is partly the institutions it created and partly the arguments it made possible. After independence was declared, the hardest part remained, actually winning the war. Britain had a professional army, a powerful navy, global resources, and the ability to strike along the coast. The Continental Army faced shortages of money, food, clothing, weapons, and trained soldiers. Washington's greatest achievement was not simply winning battles. It was keeping the army together long enough for the political situation to change. The Patriots needed endurance. They had to survive defeats, maintain morale, keep state governments functioning, and convince foreign powers that the American cause was not hopeless. The war was therefore fought not only on battlefields but also in supply lines, town committees, diplomatic missions, and public opinion. Independence required a military effort, but it also required a society capable of sustaining resistance year after year. France's entry into the war changed the balance. France did not join purely out of sympathy for American liberty. It wanted to weaken Britain and recover influence after earlier imperial losses. But for the United States, French support was decisive. It brought money, weapons, troops, naval power, and diplomatic legitimacy. The conflict became part of a wider imperial struggle, forcing Britain to think beyond the colonies. The turning point came at Yorktown in 1781. Washington and allied French forces trapped General Cornwallis's British army, while French naval strength helped prevent escape or reinforcement. Cornwallis's surrender did not instantly end the war, but it shattered Britain's confidence that victory was worth the cost. In London, the political will to continue collapsed. Yorktown showed that the empire could lose not just territory, but an entire army. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally recognized the United States as independent. Britain acknowledged American sovereignty and ceded vast territory east of the Mississippi River and south of the Great Lakes. This was a stunning outcome for a movement that had begun as resistance to taxes and imperial restrictions. But independence immediately created new challenges. The former colonies were now states, and they needed to cooperate on debt, defense, diplomacy, trade, and Western expansion. The Articles of Confederation provided a loose framework, but it gave the central government limited power. Americans had rebelled against centralized authority, so they were cautious about creating another strong government. Yet the weakness of the national system raised a new question: could a republic remain free and still govern effectively? That question led directly to the debates that produced the Constitution. The Constitution took effect in 1789, and the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. Together, they gave the Revolution a lasting institutional form, a federal republic with a written constitution, separated powers, representative government, and protections for individual liberties. The American Revolution therefore ended as more than a successful war for independence. It created a new political model based on consent, law, and rights rather than inherited royal authority. Its meaning, however, was never simple. It expanded political possibility while leaving major exclusions unresolved. It weakened monarchy in the Atlantic world, but it also began debates over federal power, citizenship, equality, and liberty that continue to shape American life. The Revolution matters because it turned protest into independence, independence into a republic, and a republic into an ongoing argument over who freedom is truly for. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.